Hi everybody, my name's Catherine Morgan and I'm a financial planner and financial coach, and I sit on the Boring Money expert panel. And we had a really great question come in last week from a reader called Nick. Now you'll be able to read this question in the post, but I just wanted to come on and actually answer this particular question on video, because there's quite a lot of really great questions in here that I think will be super valuable for you to hear rather than to read. So I'm doing this as a video message, so hopefully this will work well for you. Just to kind of point out with any questions that we get come into the panel, obviously I am a qualified financial advisor, but this video is really just to give you some information only. This is not to be taken as a personal recommendation. And of course, when we're talking about investments, there are always risks associated with investments because they can go up and down in value, and there's no guarantee what the future performance can be on any investment. So just to kind of put a little bit of a caveat on that. But a really great question that's come in from Nick. Actually, Nick reminds me of myself, very similar situation, in his late 30s. He's got a mortgage, he's got children, he has a baby, no outstanding loans or credit cards, and just some great questions around short-term, medium and long-term goals. And I love it when these questions come in, because it's lovely to hear and see that people are thinking about their financial future. But I just want to kind of pull out some of the key bits of questions that have come in from you, Nick, and answer those for you. So the first question that you asked was around medium-term savings, saving for 5 to 10 years to renovate your property, kind of in brackets, the sooner the better. So with regards to medium-term savings, if you're going to need to have access to that money in 5 to 10 years, but actually there's the potential that you might need to access that money earlier, then from an investing perspective, what you don't want to do is go into the stocks and shares, any stocks and shares environment, and then potentially need access to that money before your intended sort of term, if you like. And then maybe the market's wobbled a little bit, or it's maybe gone down in value, and then you don't want then the value of that investment to be lower than what you need it to be for the purpose of why you set it up in the first place. In this instance, the house renovation. So my kind of suggestion would be to consider perhaps keeping that money in cash. You could look at things like fixed rate savings accounts that would offer you perhaps a little bit more interest than a normal instant access savings account, so that you can still benefit from some rises in interest rates. And often with fixed rates interest bearing accounts, they'll be locked away for a number of years, maybe 2, 3, 4 or 5 years. You can still access it if you need to with some of those types of accounts. You'll generally get a bit more interest than on an instant access environment. But most importantly, it's not exposed to any risk with the capital, so that then if you do decide to do that renovation on the work earlier, which is what you're kind of referring to in this question, then at least you know that that money is protected. So that would be my suggestion, to consider something around, from a cash perspective. The second point that you made, or that you asked on here, was about longer term returns to help your children's education and to help them get on the property ladder in 20 years' time. Now, I'm presuming at this point you're thinking about your baby here. So, buying their first property at, in their 20s, perhaps they finished university or finished full-time education. Now, from that perspective, from a time point of view, you've got time on your side. So certainly from an investing perspective, you could certainly consider investing money somewhere where then that money could grow more favourably, or at least have given the opportunity to grow more favourably than just leaving it in cash. I guess from a perspective of saving for children, you've got a couple of options, whether you're saving for houses or university fees, anything that involves, their financial future. You've got a couple of options in terms of wrappers. So you've got things like junior ISAs. Now, the benefit of junior ISAs is that you can contribute just over £4,000 every year. You can go into cash, or you can go into a stocks and shares environment. Because you've got time on your hands here, then you could consider going into a stocks and shares environment, where you can ride out some of the uncertainty of the stock market, particularly in the early years, where it's not really going to impact on you financially if the market's going up and down. But you're giving yourself some opportunity for greater growth potentials than just leaving it sitting in cash for 20 years. So from that perspective, you could consider a junior ISA. The benefit of a junior ISA obviously is that then that money will be passed to your child at age 18, and then they can do with it what they wish. Now, some parents don't like that with a junior ISA. They don't like the fact that the child has control legally at 18. Obviously, you may decide just not to tell them about it, but that could be a consideration. So some parents, what they do is they don't put it into a junior ISA, they just use their own ISA allowance. So your own ISA allowance into cash or stocks and shares is £20,000 each tax year. So if you haven't sort of made the most of that opportunity and used any of your ISA allowance, then you could do that. The downsides of doing it into your own ISA is obviously it's in your name. So from a tax perspective, there's no tax to pay on the ISA or any growth that you make in that stocks and shares environment, but it is held in your name. So the really important thing, and you haven't mentioned this in your question at all, is whether you've got a will in place, because obviously if anything happens to you, worst case scenario, I know that we don't like to think about these things as parents, believe me, I have 2 little ones. You can see in the background actually one of those pictures up there. But if you haven't got a will in place, that's definitely something that I would recommend that you consider, because if you've got it in your own name, you want to make sure that pot goes to them if anything happens to you. Question 3, you talked about retiring as soon as possible. Don't we all want to do that? But realistically between 60 and 65, so in approximately 25 years' time. And the question I think that you had around this was, you've got a couple of pension pots there. You've got a personal private pension. You've got a legacy company pension, small in value. The most important thing to think about in terms of pensions, it doesn't matter whether it's in a pension or a stocks and shares ISA, it doesn't really matter from that perspective, but just pay attention to where it's invested. Make sure that it's invested in a fund that is aligned to the level of risk that you're comfortable with taking and aligned to how long you've got left until you retire. In your case, you've got a decent amount of time to be invested, and making sure it's invested in the areas that you want to be invested in. So have a look at the types of funds that you're invested in, have a look at the charges that you're paying with those particular providers. Generally speaking, if you're paying anywhere in excess of 1%, just over 1%, then that may be a little on the high side. So maybe think about, is there an alternative provider that could hold your pension for you at a lower cost? So just a couple of things to think about there. Make sure your beneficiaries are up to date on your pension as well, particularly if you've just had a baby. Make sure that your pension goes to your intended beneficiaries. So if you haven't looked at that or thought about that, go to your current pension provider, ask them for a nomination of beneficiary form. First of all, ask them, do you have any nominated beneficiaries? And if you haven't, ask them for that form, and then just update your beneficiary choices on that scheme. In terms of your question about LISA versus overpaying on your mortgage, that's a really big one, and there's lots of pros and cons of overpaying on your mortgage versus putting money into a LISA. Obviously at the moment you still qualify for a LISA, and you've got the government bonus that can be added to that plan with any contributions that you're making. The main benefit, obviously, of paying off your mortgage is you're going to be saving interest. Now, depending on what interest rate you're paying, depending on how long you've got left on your mortgage, depending on what financial plans you have in place, and when you want to be retiring, ideally mortgage-free, will depend on whether you need to be overpaying on your mortgage or not. Obviously, once you overpay it off the mortgage, you can't get that money back. So, that's something to consider. Do you have a sufficient emergency fund in place? Do you have the foundations of your finances covered? So if you couldn't work because you were poorly or something happened to you, do you have things in place that kind of protect the basic foundations of your finances? If all of those things are set and you're protected and you've got an emergency fund in place, then it will certainly be worth thinking about whether to overpay on the mortgage. The other thing you can do is ring your mortgage provider. Ask them to give you an illustration of, if you paid off £25 a month off the mortgage, what would that reduce your mortgage term by? How much interest would you save? They can normally give you an illustration on that. So that may be worth considering. In terms of stocks and shares ISAs, your question here was that you were a little confused about using platforms and choosing a basket of investments. Honestly, this is probably the most common question I get as a financial coach, is what on earth does all of this mean? What are the different platforms? How do you go about picking a basket of investments? Now, without going into the complexities of this, because I could talk about this for hours, the basics of a platform is it's just the provider. It's like Tesco's. When you go shopping for food, whether it's Tesco's, Sainsbury's, Asda's, Waitrose, they're the platform. They have shelves in the superstore that have products on those shelves. So if you think of a platform provider like a supermarket, you're just choosing which platform that's going to hold those products on their shelves. Now, obviously, if you go to Tesco's, sometimes they'll have cheaper products than Sainsbury's. Waitrose may be a bit more expensive, but you may have different access to different brands at Waitrose or different quality of foods. So if you think of it from that perspective, you're just choosing the provider of your stocks and shares ISA in the same way that you're choosing the provider for your pension. So the things to consider when you're choosing a platform, cost is the main one, because if you think about it, they're all going to have much of a similar range of products on their shelves, unless you're going to go for something particularly sexy. They're all going to be much of a muchness. So think about cost. What are they charging you? What are the platform costs for them to hold on to your stocks and shares ISA in this particular situation? In terms of choosing the basket of investment, so going back to the supermarket analogy, what you choose to put on your shelf is very dependent on your appetite for risk, how much risk you want to take, how much risk you can afford to take. You may have some particular ethical views about avoiding particular companies that may invest in arms or tobacco or animal testing or solar energy, all of these kind of things. So if you have particular ethical views, you may want to have a look at companies that offer ethical investing, and some companies will offer them, some won't. So that may determine which platform provider you use. But generally speaking, as a novice investor, you can't really, in my opinion, you can't really go wrong with a prepackaged solution to start with, because the most important thing is just to get started, right? And often, because it's so complicated, we just don't do anything. We bury our heads in the sand, and that's just the easier thing to do. So well done, first of all, for actually thinking about and looking. And I can see from your question that you've also explored things like exchange traded funds and tracker funds and things like that. So good for you. My suggestion here would be to think about costs. We've talked about values and ethical investing. Also think about things like, do you want to run your investments via your app? Do you want to have somewhere that has educational videos? Do you want to have someone that has a customer service team that you can ring? What kind of service are you looking for? And actually, my suggestion would be to head to the Boring Money Best Buys tab on the top of their website. On the left-hand side, you've got some filter buttons. So just tick in their stocks and shares ISA, and also tick the second filter box, which is like beginner investor. And then they have automatically done some research, independent research, on some of the companies that would fit that criteria. And then you can have a look. There'll be companies in that will pop up there like Nutmeg, Wealth Simple, and Pension Bee, for example. There's some other ones on there to have a look at. But just jump onto their websites, have a play around with their tools. Often some of the companies, what they'll do is they'll give you an idea as to what that basket of investments will look like before you actually decide to invest. So have a look at those. Have a look at their charges. Have a look at their apps. Have a look at their websites. Just get that gut feel as to which one kind of attracts you the most. Have a look at some of the reviews on the Boring Money website as well, because there's some consumer reviews on there as to what their personal experience has been like. And then just pick one. And if you are a novice and you don't want to put you don't want to put your own investments together yourself, then just have a look at the pre-packaged ones. Because the great thing about pensions or stocks and shares ISAs is that you can just switch them. If you go into a pre-packaged solution, so it's a bit like, if you're not sure what to wear, you might go to a superstore, a high street store, and you'll look at the mannequin and you'll just say, that looks great, because it's all been pre-packaged for you. Or you may be a bit more confident to put an outfit together for yourself. So it's exactly the same. You can always switch it later. If you become more experienced and more interested and you're reading more about it and investing in your own knowledge, then that will boost your confidence. And then obviously you'll be able to move things about from there. And I guess that kind of leads into my final point, or one of my final points, is that So I'm currently running a podcast actually around investing, and I know that Boring Money have got some podcasts bits on their website too. So check out podcast too for increasing your knowledge about investing. So my podcast is In Her Financial Shoes. So do check that out. We're in the current investing series. So we've got lots of interviews going on there with some of the CEOs of some of these companies, and lots of content, free content for you to listen to, just to kind of boost your confidence in this particular area. What else did you ask? I guess the other thing that I would mention here is that one of the benefits of going to see, you've mentioned you've gone to see a financial advisor before, but one of the areas that you may also want to consider, which may help you to make some of these decisions, is to going to see a financial planner. The difference between a planner and an advisor is that an advisor typically will focus on the product side of things. So they'll talk to you about pensions and ISAs and investments and bits and pieces, which is great. But if you're wanting to create more of an idea as to what impact these decisions will have on your finances, then engaging with a financial planner is really, really beneficial, because they'll be able to map out visually for you what would happen if you were to overpay on your mortgage, what would happen if you were to move from cash to stocks and shares, what would happen if you were to go into a low risk investment versus a high risk investment, what impact would that have physically and financially. And we use some technology to show you visually through graphs what impact that would actually have. So that may help you make some decisions if you're wanting to go that next level on to making decisions for yourself, but actually engaging with a financial planner. And often financial planners, if you want to go and buy the products for yourself, that's fine. You can go off and do that. But if you want their expertise to actually help you to map out what that looks like, then that's when the expertise of a financial planner can be really, really beneficial for you. So that's also something worth considering. And that's it really. So I hope that's answered your question, Nick. As I say, it is quite a big topic. I really appreciate you've got a couple of, great questions in there. I hope this has been valuable to you. And if anybody else has any other questions that they want to ask, please feed them through into the Boring Money Expert panel, and we'll be delighted to help. Thanks very much. Bye.